On November 1, 2018, a WOW Air Airbus A321 conveying 193 people from KFIC Iceland to Baltimore, Maryland was still on its climb when the pilots were paralyzed by a cautioning from the EAM. They saw that the oil level for one of the arrangement's motors was diminishing at a mysteriously extraordinary rate inside just minutes it had been totally depleted with their plane a great many feet over the Atlantic Sea. The pilots expected to respond rapidly to this circumstance or endanger everybody on board. What occurred next? This is the foundation story of WOW Air Flight 117. WOW Air Flight 117 was a standard flight booked to leave on the 1st of November 2018 from KEFL Worldwide Air Terminal in Iceland to Washington Worldwide TH Great Marshall Air Terminal in Baltimore, Maryland. The airplane utilized for the flight was a one-year-old Airbus A321-200 with enrollment code TFWIIN 7650, which had aggregated more than 7,000 flight hours at the hour of the flight. It had as of late finished its almost 2-week long CA. Really take a look at examination with Adria Tenor in Ljubljana Air Terminal, Slovenia. AC check review is in broad assessment system which looks at basically every framework fundamental to a plane's capability. Because of the length of the review cycle, they happen at generally lengthy spans which depend on the quantity of flight cycles or months in help which the plane has committed to. If any framework or part of the airplane is viewed as non-utilitarian or debased during AC really look at examination, it is generally fixed, supplanted or overhauled to guarantee that the plane is in ideal condition for protected and consistent activity anyway. In this situation, those accountable for directing the redesign systems unwittingly made a critical, also possibly undermining blunder in the establishment of an indispensable instrument. After the A321 finished 13 flight legs without any issues following its C-check review, it would have been sensible for the designers and team to feel certain about the adequacy of the checks and fixes. The impeccable presentation of the airplane probably consoled them that everything had been THLY tended to. It would be the same for the two pilots working Flight 117. The two pilots for the flight incorporated a 45-year-old skipper who had amassed over 8,500 flight hours, actually making him more knowledgeable about trip than the airplane of the day. Around 4,000 of those hours had come as a commander. With him was a 43-year-old first official who had amassed just over 2,500 flight hours of his own on Flight 117. The pilots were the flight joined by 5 Lodge Group individuals. Furthermore, 186 travelers. The chief was allocated the job of pilot observing while his co-pilot was liable for flying the airplane. The excursion was supposed to require roughly 6 hours. On that pivotal day, the commander directed his stroll around checks as expected to guarantee that all of the arrangement's essential parts expected for a safe flight were in great shape. On the surface, everything looked unblemished and he felt happy with what he had inspected, much to his dismay that the genuine danger to the well-being of his flight had been concealed inside, where his eyes proved unable to see. Back inside the cockpit, the pilots noticed the fundamental flight frameworks, what's more, viewed them as functioning as they should. The inner well-being checks were likewise sure, and this conceded the pilots all the certainty they expected to start flight procedures. There were 186 travelers then, at that point, boarded the airplane and sunk into their seats as they anticipated departure. The pilots closing all the fundamental agendas mentioned leeway from the air terminal's control pinnacle to advance towards the runway. The climate along the flightway was cold and overcast, yet an adjudicator to be sufficiently moderate not to represent any worry for flying. The airplane at last pushed back from its entryway and advanced down to its chosen runway, after which the pilots mentioned departure leeway, which they appropriately got at around 3:48 p.m. neighborhood time. The plane started moving down the runway. Inside a couple of moments, Flight 117 had become airborne. However, it wouldn't take extremely well before the first difficult situation would seem. Following a scarcely any unremarkable minutes during the airplane's ascension, the pilots were met with a surprising caution from the arrangement's ECOM. It was showing that the motor oil amount for the plane's number 2 motor had in some way dropped to around 3L. This was an especially frightening cautioning on the grounds that figure is not exactly a sixth of what had been recorded previously. The flight started. This alarm had come while Flight 117 was around 7,000 feet in the air, which made it a considerably really appalling prospect for the oil drop. Pilots of the almost 18.5 LERD kept in every one of the plane's motors before the trip north of 15 had strangely evaporated from one of them. At first, it might have appeared like an incorrect perusing, as other related measurements on the flight PCs looked ordinary. However, in the event that there wasn't a blunder someplace, then the pilots were in huge Inconvenience, very much like in some other machine, oil is essential for greasing up the imperative mechanical pieces of a plane to forestall rubbing initiated wear and overheating, which can cause serious harm. As they counseled the airplane's fast reference handbook, the pilots preceded the move while they firmly checked the oil temperature and tension. Regardless of the continuous checking, it never really forestalled the drop in the impacted motor's oil levels. By the time they rose past 11,000 feet, they seen something disturbing. The motor's oil level had dropped to zero. The pilots were all the while mulling over whether the oil amount perusing they were checking out was really right, as not exclusively was it so abrupt, yet both the oil temperature also pressure readings appeared to be steady anyway. When the oil pressure readings likewise started to drop a couple of moments later, it ended up being clear to them that something had turned out badly in the motor oil area. The clearest doubt was a hole in the impacted motor, something the pilots knew nothing about at the time. It was subsequently connected to an error in the establishment process completed by experts during the C-check review. During the system, the experts had obviously neglected to adhere to the point-by-point guidelines from the Airbus Airplane Support Manual for the establishment of the oil channels component, picking rather to follow methods from the overall support handbook, which pretty much seemed to be an outline. The consequence of their activities was that the oil channel was introduced before it was actually fit to do as such, delivering the arrangement of its channel finder pin frail. The circumstance deteriorated due to the inappropriate situation of a basic part, the dark O-ring, as opposed to being introduced on the channel cover where it should have been. It had erroneously been put on the channel plug. Throughout the 13 resulting trips before Flight 117, motor vibrations made the arrangement of the oil channel component more vulnerable, and on Flight 117 it would at long last arrive at breaking point as the oil pressure went after the number 2 motor kept on dropping. The ECAM proclaimed a low oil pressure, cautioning this made the pilots course through their reference handbook as they dissected their problematic circumstance. Despite the fact that Flight 117 was around 21,000 feet in the air at that point, it ended up being clear to the pilots that the number 2 motor should be closed down straightaway before the circumstance could deteriorate. EOPS rules permitted pilots of the Airbus A321 to proceed with flight tasks with a solitary practical motor, yet the air terminal in Baltimore was still above and beyond 5 hours away. Going on towards the air terminal with a sole working motor, particularly under such illogical conditions, could have basically shown to be a demise wish. The pilot inferred that preceding crisis landing the flight did not merit the gamble and decided on a crisis arrival at the closest air terminal, which turned out to be Keek. The very air terminal they had withdrawn from, the chief gave a container skillet crisis call and informed air traffic control of the circumstance unfurling on Flight 117. The arrangement to get back to KVIC was a brilliant one, yet it was one which was confronted with one significant boundary: the plane's fuel tanks were still generally full. This implied that the plane would be excessively weighty to direct this arranged landing, except if the pilots figured out how to free the airplane of the additional fuel weight. What made the issue of fuel load shedding much more that's what tricky in that particular situation was the Airbus A321 isn't furnished with a fuel unloading instrument like most bigger planes, or this totally eliminated the choice of unloading fuel into the sea underneath. The failure to dump fuel left the pilots with just 2 choices. It is possible that they circumnavigated their new objective for tens of minutes until they caught fire enough fuel, or they went on to direct an overweight handling. The issue with the main arrangement was that they would in any case confront the gamble of flying longer on a solitary motor whose genuine circumstance was muddled to them given what had occurred with the first. The pilots in the long run settled on going through with the second intent to finish an overweight arrival, a move which had critical dangers of its own. With one motor previously bombing, the pilots needed to depend on the plane's arrival gear and frameworks, which were fundamental for finishing the crisis arrival. They trusted these basic parts wouldn't bomb them too. In the meantime, in the lodge, a few travelers had begun to detect that something was the matter with the impacted motor. To forestall any frenzy, the airline stewards needed to console them that the circumstance was taken care of without a doubt. Over the ensuing minutes, the pilots would demonstrate that they genuinely had the circumstance under control. With extraordinary consideration and exertion, the pilots perseveringly managed all the agendas, all while keeping up with steady correspondence with air traffic control. The airline stewards, and each different, they did all things required to hold control of the airplane under these challenging